praising the armed forces for helping realize the inter-Korean military agreement. South Korea's exports fall for a 10th straight month, caught in the middle of the region's trade wars. Semiconductors up in volume, but down in price. And South Korea's consumer inflation, for the first time, falls below zero. The statistics agency says, though, it's not deflation, but the result of new government healthcare support. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in, attending a ceremony for Armed Forces Day, said a strong defense for South Korea is what fuels efforts for peace on the peninsula. The ceremony was at an air base in Daegu, in Korea's southeast. Shin Se-min has the details.
South Korea's commander-in-chief has promised to make the nation's defense forces stronger than before. Addressing the 71st Armed Forces Day ceremony, President Moon Jae-in said the nation's strong military is the driving force behind the Korean peace process.
평화는 지키는 것이 아니라 만들어내는 것입니다. 우리 군의 철통 같은 안보가 대화와 협력을 뒷받침하고 항구적 평화를 향해 담대하게 걸을 수 있게 합니다.
Praising the military's courage and dedication, the president said South Korea was able to reduce border tensions through the military's determination to realize the inter-Korean military agreement. He also thanked the country's sharp readiness for allowing the leaders of the two Koreas and the U.S. to stand and cross the military demarcation line. Looking ahead, the president promised an even more prepared military.
누구도 넘볼 수 없는 안보 태세를 갖추겠습니다. 평화와 번영의 초석이 되겠습니다.
Moon also said his administration will realize the Defense Reform 2.0 initiative, partly preparing for the takeover of wartime operational control of its troops from the U.S. The president added that the government has allocated a larger chunk of its budget to defense next year and said it plans to spend over $42 billion in developing a more accurate missile defense system, brand new submarines, spy satellites, and quasi-aircraft carriers. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
And in today's ceremony for Armed Forces Day, South Korea showcased its new F-35A stealth fighter jets. The F-35s enable the Air Force to evade radar detection, and it's believed that's one of the main reasons North Korea has criticized their acquisition, saying they threaten peace on the peninsula and in the region. South Korea aims to have 13 F-35As by the end of this year and 40 by 2021. North Korea's ambassador to the UN is urging the United States to come to the negotiating table, but with a new proposal. He says the approach the U.S. has been taking until now has not worked, and the North will wait patiently for a change. Lee Seung-jae has this report.
On the final day of the annual gathering of world leaders at the United Nations on Monday, North Korea's ambassador to the UN, Kim Sung, called for the full implementation of the statement issued by the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. after their first summit in Singapore last year.
The relations between the DPRK and the U.S. have made little progress so far, and the situation on the Korean Peninsula has not come out of the vicious cycle of increased tension, which is entirely attributable to the political and military provocations perpetrated by the U.S.
Kim says it's up to Washington to turn any future nuclear talks into a window of opportunity or an occasion that will hasten the crisis. And in order to improve the chance of striking a nuclear deal, he said Washington needs to come to nuclear talks with a new proposal.
Comrade Kim Jong-un, chairman of the State Affairs Commission, in his historical policy speech, stated the position that there was a need for the U.S. to put aside its current method of calculation and approach us with a new one, and we wait with patience for a courageous decision from the U.S.
Last month, Pyongyang expressed its willingness to resume working-level talks in late September, saying it believes the U.S. will come up with a mutually acceptable proposal. However, last week, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told reporters that no meetings had been scheduled, but the U.S. stands ready to restart talks anytime. The North Korean envoy also criticized the South Korean government, accusing it of double-dealing. He said Seoul entered into inter-Korean agreements last year only to deploy ultra-modern U.S. weapons and hold joint military exercises with Washington this year.
It is attributable to the double-dealing behavior of the South Korean authorities, who performed the act of a handshake of peace before all, but behind the scenes, introduced ultra-modern offensive weapons and held joint military exercises with the United States, targeting the DPRK.
Despite earlier speculation that the UN gathering could set the stage for high-level talks between Pompeo and his North Korean counterpart Lee Young-ho, Lee was absent this year after being present at the previous 3 UN events. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The UN Security Council's North Korea Sanctions Committee has given permission for NGOs to bring items worth over $300,000 into North Korea for humanitarian purposes in the coming months. According to the committee's website, the World Health Organization was given the go-ahead last week to take in 3 vehicles for the safe transportation of its staff. An Irish NGO, Concern Worldwide, will also be allowed to take in threshers, tractors, and other devices to improve water quality for their work on nutrition and hygiene. These are among 8 exemptions the committee granted in September for humanitarian work. That compares to 3 exemptions in August and 4 in July. The slump in South Korea's exports continued for a 10th month in a row in September. Part of it's the U.S.-China trade war, but also low prices for semiconductors. Exports to Japan are down too because of Tokyo's trade restrictions. Our Hong Yu reports.
September was another month to forget for South Korea's exports. External conditions such as the U.S.-China trade dispute and South Korea-Japan trade dispute have hit exports to all these countries. The Trade Ministry says outbound shipments plunged 11.7% on year last month to around $44.7 billion. Imports also fell 5.6% on year to some $38.7 billion. The nation's exports have been in constant decline since December 2018. The actual volume of semiconductor and petrochemical exports increased in September, but their falling prices contributed to an overall decrease. South Korea's exports to Japan went down almost 6% on year, as the neighbors remain locked in a trade spat. Tuesday marks 3 months since the Japanese government announced its decision to impose export restrictions on 3 key materials used in the production of semiconductors and displays. And the South Korean government has said export approvals for the 3 materials are being permitted only in a highly restrictive manner. It added that despite Korea's efforts for talks, Japan has not responded. Seoul has again urged Tokyo to re-examine its position in order to solve this issue through consultations. Yet there are some hopes for a recovery in exports, as both South Korea's trade surplus and the daily average trading volume for September reached the highest level this year. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
The World Trade Organization is sided with South Korea in a dispute over anti-dumping duties on Japanese pneumatic valves. The WTO adopted a report on Monday saying South Korea's duties on these parts from Japan do not violate WTO rules. Pneumatic valves are used in the auto industry and in electronics, and 70% of the ones South Korea imports come from Japan. In 2015, South Korea decided to impose anti-dumping duties on them for a period of 5 years. In 2016, Japan challenged the measure at the WTO's dispute settlement body. For the first time, South Korea's consumer inflation has fallen into minus territory last month. But despite the drop, the government's dismissing concerns about deflation. Choi Young reports.
Statistics Korea revealed Tuesday that South Korea's overall consumer price growth recorded minus 0.4% in September compared to the same month last year, something that has never happened since the agency began collecting related data in 1965. Since January this year, consumer inflation in South Korea has remained below 1%. The agency said last month's fall is only a temporary blip due to government's efforts to provide free education at all high schools and because more diseases are now covered by state health insurance. Lower agricultural, fishery, and oil prices also drag on growth. In particular, agricultural goods prices tumbled by around 8% on year due to the relatively stable weather in South Korea this summer. Oil prices were down about 6%. At an economic policy meeting on Tuesday, the Finance Ministry and the Central Bank insisted the weak inflation data seen in recent months isn't enough to trigger deflation concerns just yet. Vice Finance Minister Kim Yong-bum pointed to South Korea's improving consumer sentiment index as a reason to be relatively optimistic for a turnaround before too long. 최시영, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news at this hour. For that, I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, thank you as always for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, always.
Well, this week we've seen reports that the Trump administration is looking at ways to limit investment in China by possibly delisting Chinese stocks. Officials denying that, however. What's the story there and in the global markets?
Sure. As you already know, that on last Friday, because of the news that they're limiting the Chinese stocks listing in the U.S. or any investment to Chinese company to be limited, was making a very negative news that allowed the overall market to go down quite significantly. But yesterday, it recovered as the listing of Chinese stocks in the U.S. Was fake news, according to the Peter Navarro, who is the advisor to the White House. As you know, that Peter Navarro is the most aggressive in terms of the Chinese-related policies, and he's the person who wrote Death by China. So he is quite anti-Chinese in terms of the various measures that he's recommending to the White House. And if he says that is a fake news, then maybe it is accepted as such. So clearly the news has initially negatively impacted, but now it seems to be moving away. But still, nevertheless, there is a distrust between U.S. and China in relating to the trade policies. As far as the market's concerned, they all recovered quite nicely. U.S. was up 0.5%, S&P, and 0.75% for NASDAQ. Also, European market slightly up less than 0.5%. Nikkei is up over 0.7%. Taiwan's up 1%. And also, Kospi seems to be recovering nicely as well, as Kospi was up about 0.%. Kosdaq is up 1.5%. As for China, it's closed.
Yeah, we'll have to see if it is fake news or not. Some do say that would be the logical next move for the U.S. But sure. Here in Korea, a free trade agreement is coming into effect today with countries in Central America. Exports haven't been so great for Korea recently with the trade wars affecting Asia. So what kind of opportunity does this Central America deal present? And what might those countries want to buy from Korea?
Sure. In terms of the news flows, yes, it is positive news. But in terms of the actual amount of the positive news or positive indication for the export, we're not sure that is going to be that significant. But nevertheless, it is positive news. The Nicaragua and Honduras have signed FTA with Korea, and it is 16th FTA that Korea is signing. In terms of what kind of goods that these countries might be importing from Korea would be auto, steels and cosmetics and medicine related. So those sectors should benefit somewhat. Also, government is saying that the energy and infrastructure and construction related businesses or deals could be made quite sharply, and that should benefit the overall the pictures for Korean economy. But in terms of the economic size of these countries, it's very small. So I don't know whether that's going to be anything majorly significant. But nevertheless, in terms of the flows of news, it is finally one positive news coming after various numbers of negative news.
Yes, indeed. And speaking of one of today's biggest stories, we see consumer inflation fell below zero in September, the first time that's ever happened. Obviously, people are talking about deflation, though Statistics Korea says that's not what this is. Why is inflation now negative, and do you think it's going to keep dropping?
Well, I mean, we should expect a low inflationary environment. We're not sure whether, we are entering a deflationary environment, but clearly we are entering an area of stagflation or stagnation phase where inflation is probably below 1% kind of territories. As you said, it is down by 0.4% year on year. This is first time since 1965. In terms of the why it has actually occurred, the agriculture and fishery price down 8.2%, quite significant drop. So food prices were the major reason. And also the manufacturing-related industrial production prices were down 0.2% as well, which is troublesome. The government is saying that it is because of the education support and health insurance incentives that have increased, allow the inflation number to turn negative. And it's temporary, and it's that inflation should recover. But I think that in terms of the population changes that we're seeing, and the various numbers are indicating that growth rates are slowing down quite significantly, we are probably entering a much slower pace of the price increases in terms of inflation. I think the one thing that we need to watch out is that we do need to see a lot more aggressive boosting measures, particularly in the fiscal side, as well as the monetary policy side. Yes, we are seeing some measures that is allowing the economies to recover somewhat, but I think that the size of the effort is much more needed in the future.
Another interest rate cut perhaps this year?
Sure.
All right, Mr. You'll be watching that story very closely. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much.
Well, now South Korean Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon has called for the government and related agencies to do everything they can do to prevent the spread of African swine fever. No new cases in the past few days, but he says the authorities need to stay vigilant. Here's the PM in a meeting earlier today.
Since Friday, there were no more confirmed cases of African swine fever, but it's too early to be relieved. All parts of Incheon, Gyeonggi-do, and Gangwon-do provinces are subject to tighter controls. But we should also pay attention to other areas, such as Chungcheong-do and Gyeongsangbuk-do provinces. I asked for the strict implementation of our current quarantine measures.
Prime Minister Lee pointed out to officials the importance of thoroughly disinfecting vehicles that pass through the concerned areas. He also told authorities to stay alert for other diseases such as avian influenza and foot and mouth disease, which often break out as the weather gets cooler. Regarding Typhoon Mitag, expected to bring heavy rain to the peninsula this week, Lee once again called for extra care to prevent damage to farms and to deal with any other possible accidents. At the UN General Assembly last week, President Moon Jae-in proposed turning the heavily guarded demilitarized zone into a global landmark of peace. And a small town within the DMZ is perhaps the latest part of that process. It's isolated from the rest of the country, but it's connected at ultra-high speed through one of the world's first 5G mobile networks. Oh Soo-young has more.
This is perhaps one of the most secluded and heavily guarded villages on Earth. Past the barbed wire fences and military checkpoints, Taesongdong Freedom Village lies within the 4-kilometre-wide demilitarized zone that splits the two Koreas. But it has undergone a transformation, becoming one of the most connected high-tech places, running on the 5G mobile network and state-of-the-art IT infrastructure.
Traditional telescopes gave you a very limited view of the North Korean towns across the border, but using this augmented reality touchscreen, you can see the streets and the buildings up close and even watch people riding their bicycles all in real time.
Earlier this year, KT Corporation launched its 5G village solution developed for isolated communities. Despite enjoying a high level of income and exemption from taxes and military duties, the 197 residents live under a strict curfew and are required to stay in the village for most of the year. Inside the village's solitary school, some 30 students now learn by using some of the most advanced smart gadgets and software on the market. These also help them overcome their physical limitations.
I developed a VR program that gives you a tour of Taesongdong. I want other people to enjoy our village as they can't get here easily.
Coding artificial intelligence programs is one of the new classes offered on the school's curriculum. Sensors and IoT gadgets provided by KT are applied in other classes too, such as gym class, allowing students to interact with children from other schools. The village is also overcoming physical restraints in farming, its main source of income. A smart farm solution allows them to monitor their crops and water them remotely through 5G.
We used to be escorted to the fields by a soldier, but now I can control the switches or just look at the crops from home or outside the village without going through that process.
Other smart solutions include sensors to boost energy efficiency and air quality, as well as an emergency response system that connects all of the village's 46 households.
The smart LED light doesn't just turn on and off. It has a speaker that gives announcements and disaster alerts. So if there's an emergency, we can respond quickly. It gives us a peace of mind.
The Moon Jae-in administration hopes to transform the DMZ from a symbol of division to a landmark of peace, to break the decades of deadlock following the Korean War.
I think today I saw, and all of us saw, what could be the future, a technology-based, human-friendly village that people can use effectively and for peace.
Just 400 meters from the border, the road to peace and prosperity, and one day a truly connected Korea begins right here in Daesungdong Freedom Village. 오수영, Arirang News, Paju.
And another typhoon is on its way to South Korea, likely to hit the southern coast by Thursday. It'll bring heavy downpours and strong winds to most of the country, but less so for the capital, Seoul. Our Ji-young has the latest.
The 18th typhoon of the season, Mitag, is expected to reach Korea's south coast around Thursday. If it stays on its projected path, it'll bring heavy rainfall to most of the country. According to the Korea Meteorological Administration, as of 12 p.m. today, the typhoon was about 400 kilometers southeast of Shanghai, China, and is moving north toward Jeju Island. By noon on Wednesday, Mitag is forecast to be roughly 240 kilometers off Korea's southernmost island of Jeju. It is then expected to pass through Mokpo in Jeollanam-do province on Thursday morning and will head towards South Korea's easternmost island of Dokdo. By the time the typhoon reaches Korea, it is forecast to have a maximum wind speed of roughly 100 kilometers per hour. Heavy downpours and strong gusts are likely to lash Jeju Island and southern parts of the country today as the typhoon approaches. The National Weather Agency has issued heavy rain warnings as of 11 a.m. on Tuesday for Jeollado provinces, and parts of this region are currently receiving up to 30 millimeters of rain per hour, accompanied by thunder and lightning. Typhoon Mitag is expected to be as strong as the recent Typhoon Tafa, and as serious damage is expected, experts advise people to prepare for the typhoon to minimize any damage. Ji-young, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.